Live from Eudaimonia Institute in lovely Nevada City.
Hey everyone, this is a delight and an exciting opportunity to do one of these in person. I guess I should say in some ways, welcome to the Metamodern Meaning podcast, that's where this is going, as a continuation of a series that Layman and I have been doing in an ongoing way called Realizing the Biosphere. And I suppose this marks sort of a nice culmination of that series, and a bringing together, a wrapping up of a lot of the themes that you and I have been talking about. So yeah, thank you for who's here, and this is a really wonderful opportunity to be in this beautiful place. We're doing this at Eudaimonia Institute, Eudaimonia Retreat Center in Nevada City, California, where we are wrapping up the Metamodern Spirituality Lab here. And big thanks to Nick Hedlund for all the wonderful support and organizational skills that have made this all possible. So, yeah, why don't we dive into it? I think the thought for today is I wanted to give a little spiel and try to connect some strands together that have been coming up over the weekend, over our time together, but also that have come up in our conversations. So some of that is sort of a recap, and some of it is sort of general stuff that maybe is just sort of understood in common knowledge at this point, but I figured it'd be nice to have an opportunity to just lay it all out there. So that's kind of the first thing I thought I would do, and then...
I'd love to have Brennan give us his sort of summary overview and new trends in this body of thought we've been building up across these interviews, and then I'll respond and play back to what he said a little bit, and then we'll bring everybody in. Also, I'd like to advocate that for simplicity's sake, we refer to the Realizing the Biosphere series as simply R-ing the B.
Sounds good. So yeah, I'll give a little set of reflections, get your thoughts. We'll open it up and try to get some group engagement from who's here. So, yeah, I guess provisionally I thought I would title this something like Shepherds of Biocomplexity, or Shepherding Biocomplexity. And I want to say a little bit of what I mean by that, because this has been a really powerful idea for me to understand the potential role of the human in the biosphere, for the biosphere, and I find to be a helpful kind of framing to tie these things together. So the first thing there I guess I'd want to explain is biocomplexity. A lot of people have probably heard the term biodiversity, and that does a lot of work helping to explain what we mean by ecosystems, where there are a lot of different parts, a lot of different organisms that are all in sort of a relationship, and that diversity is what creates this richness and the fecundity. What I want to add to that is a sense of the complexity dynamic, or the vector of complexity. So one way of thinking about what I'd like to do is to try to connect or bridge regenerative permaculture to big history and understand why regenerative permaculture is so important in light of the kind of broad big history narrative that situates the human relative to the biosphere. So hopefully when you see it in that light, this was my experience anyways, it just radically transformed my understanding of why this is significant, and has the potential, I think, to radically transform people's understanding of themselves and their role in the biosphere. So one kind of way into this, which I think is pretty intuitive, but it's also become appropriately deconstructed and problematized, is something like the food chain. There's an idea that, the fly eats the nutrients out of the piece of shit, and then the frog eats the fly, and then some bigger animal eats the frog, and so on and so forth. And of course, these kinds of dynamics have probably been recognized since time immemorial. In a modern context, that comes to be framed as this food chain that basically leads all the way up to human beings, which are at the top of the food chain, and we just eat everything. So it's like we are the master predator now in the entire biosphere in that sense. And we are so because we've been able to leverage our incredible intelligence and our technological capacities to put us there. We're not more ferocious than a tiger, or we don't have the incredible acuity of some animals in terms of smell or radar or that kind of thing. But what we have is this conceptual apparatus that has given us this unique evolutionary adaptive edge, and we use that to basically claw our way to the top of the food chain chain, and everything leads to us. So that's a very kind of modern notion of this idea, and it's ultimately kind of one literally of consumption, right? It's like the idea of this chain of what eats what all the way up to us. And as I said, that kind of gets I think appropriately problematized in more postmodern critiques, right? So I don't know if you've seen this meme. There's a picture, and it says, it's got like a picture of the food chain in this pyramid leading up to the human, and it says ego underneath it. And then the next version is the human is sort of in the center of a circle with all these other organisms, but not really at the top or at the bottom, just one in the mix. And that says eco. And there's this notion of moving from ego to eco is sort of this really important move that people in kind of postmodern skeptical orientations of that modern worldview are trying to advocate for. And a lot of that's very prominent in permaculture contexts. I tend to find that the people who really get permaculture and regenerative agriculture and these sorts of things tend to be profoundly critical of the modern industrial system, and in large part that's what spurred them to explore these areas. But there's a profound skepticism and there's a profound criticism of placing the human in anything other than a sort of radically egalitarian relationship to the rest of nature. And in that context, which again I was swimming in for a long time, there's this notion that the human is really at best only destructive, right? We're this weird aberration, and that set of cognitive capacities and intelligences in our technology are actually a kind of cancerous metastasizing thing that's come out of nature and is consuming it and destroying it. And that is basically all we seem to be capable of. There's good reason to be profoundly concerned about all those dynamics, and when we talk about the Metacrisis, I think that we're getting at these feedback cycles that are leading to unsustainable futures. So a lot of that criticism, again, is entirely warranted, but it has the consequence of placing the human as an aberration, something alienated from nature, and actually, in a sense, the least valuable or beneficial element of the entire ecosystem. And I've been with people, some partners of mine have had the perception that common that it'd be better if like humans just didn't exist, because then the ecosystem would find its harmony and everything would just be better. So it's almost like this choice between sort of ecocide or suicide, and some people frame it very much in those terms. And that's a very pessimistic, kind of dark place to be relative to your own anthropology. Being a person who has to be inherently aware or convinced of the idea that being a person is what's bad and destroying the world. A lot of people are operating from that, and you can imagine the kind of ways that can feed into meaning issues, the meaning crisis, in a sense of what is our purpose here if all that we're doing is making things worse. And so what has been really transformative for me is bringing the insights of regenerative permaculture and systems-based thinking about agriculture and about our relationship to the biosphere into connection with a big history framework that situates the human in a different way, that I think, again, just reimagines our role in the biosphere. And for me, this was particularly, I think the seed of this thought, or more like a lightning flash, came when I was reading a particular permaculture writer named Ben Falk, who lives in Vermont. He does something called whole systems design, and basically employs permaculture categories to bring out the maximal regenerative capacities of landscapes. So he bought this really steep hilly property, but then he put in these level terraces that catches the water. He grows rice in Vermont. And I was reading his book, and it's just like, we need to be doing this. But what he suggested was that human beings are uniquely capable because of our intelligence, because of our ability to be reflective about some of the dynamics and patterns in nature, to enhance them. So yes, we have historically been using, particularly over the last 200 years, these capacities, these novel human capacities, in a largely destructive way. But those very capacities are also the potential means by which we could fulfill a distinctly unique function in the biosphere, because no other being in this biosphere that we're aware of is conceptually self-reflectively aware of the biosphere as such and of the patterns that the biosphere uses to generate fecundity and flourishing and thriving ecosystems. And so, because of that, rather than necessarily seeing ourselves as the lone destructive force in the biosphere, we could see ourselves as being uniquely positioned to actually amplify what we see and recognize and experience of profound value in the biosphere. When I encountered that, it was very mind-blowing for me because it inverted the entire frame that I was used to, and it gave a new way to understand our role. When I was able to marry that with big history frameworks and understand a little bit more why that might be the case, I found that it also really transformative. And I think this allows us to return or recapitulate some of those insights from the modern period, but in a new way, so that you get something like the food chain, but not in a consumptive, extractive understanding of it. Rather, you can see that, when a fly is taking nutrients off the piece of shit, and then the frog eats the fly and the animal eats the frog, this is an increase in complexity across an ecosystem. And that what you're seeing is something go from a simpler state to a more complex state, and living in dynamic relations of predation and prey in that environment in such a way that you get a thriving ecosystem. And seeing that through the lens of complexification adds a new way of appreciating that. And in this sense, when we look around and understand the complexification story of the last 14 billion years or so, and it is the case, seemingly, that human beings have a uniquely positioned role in that complexification arc, something like our understanding of our position in that food chain returns, but not in a consumptive way. It's we, in some ways, have the privilege of being at this spear point of a complexification process, and that's what our cognitive intelligences are a part of. If we recognize that unique position, to then return back to what we've emerged out of and help use those capacities and our cognitive complexity to enhance the biocomplexity, then we can experience, I think, something profoundly meaningful about our place in the universe rather than feeling so alienated from it. So simple as it may sound, I don't think a lot of people necessarily view it that way. I think when we tend to think of food chains and these kinds of things, we tend to immediately go to that problematized version. But if you start looking at ecosystems as connective tissues of complexification, then the very story of big history is right before you, and you're seeing it play out in real time. And this leads then to biocomplexity, which I want to emphasize, which is then it's not just a biodiversity of a kind of horizontal axis of a bunch of different organisms interacting. It is that, but it's also that on a kind of vertical axis as well, that very dynamic leads to increasingly complex interrelationships of different kinds of organisms. And when we see a thriving ecosystem, we're seeing that. We're seeing a vertical and a horizontal and a vertical access to biospheric transformation. And so the last point then I'd want to throw into that is this notion of shepherding, which is that I see the role of the human in this as being able to gain a self-reflective awareness about their capacity to shepherd this process. Nature by itself won't always make the most thriving, most biocomplex ecosystems. This gets at this meaningful distinction that we were talking a little bit in the garden of like the different strands or layers of what we mean by nature. Yes, it's all natural, but there's also particularly these patterns or principles that nature uses that when we see something and we're struck by that ecological complexity and diversity and flourishing, we're seeing not just nature, we're seeing nature performing a certain kind of function that is, in a sense, most natural, right? That there's something that is amplified there in a particular way, and that registers to us as being full of depth and value and importance, and generally bleeds into a set of relationships of which we are the beneficiaries as well. And so what I would suggest is that if humans have this unique capacity to use our intelligence, not for destruction, but to tend to areas of the ecosystem that we can actually amplify the biocomplexity through intentional interventions, then we're able to use what's distinctly human, in a sense, the artificiality of our technology and of our minds, to bring out more of nature. And so as we've been walking around this incredible property and seeing the interventions that Nick and folks have been doing here, and we see the beaver dam analogs that have been set up that backfill areas with water so that now nutrients are staying in the ground, and that gives the opportunity for a new niche to be constructed. There's water there, so animals will come and all this. You're getting an expansiveness of that biocomplexity where there wouldn't have been minus human intervention. In the Sahara, there's a desertification remediation processes in place where people are going into the desert, putting straw in the ground, which allows the water to pool, which allows the nutrients to stay, which allows more vegetation to emerge, which brings the animals. And a ecosystem emerges out of simple desert, right? Just the material, mineral elements wind up complexifying into biological elements. So you get a kind of mini story of cosmic complexification through well-intentioned and successful human interventions into a less complex, biocomplex ecosystem. This is the basic idea I wanted to offer as a kind of holistic container for everything that we've been seeing here, talking about here, and the ways that metamodern engagements with big history and complexity narratives weave a very complex conceptual and practice-oriented tapestry for understanding the role of human in nature. So that was what I'm getting at in terms of the invitation to become a shepherd of biocomplexity, to think of yourself that way, to find instances in your local environment where you can actually do that and participate with nature in the complexification process, to be part of the creative generation of the world. I guess the last thing I'll say, and then get your thoughts, is I think this is a radical way of rethinking the human in the world, one that is profoundly optimistic, one that gives us a sense of meaning and purpose. And as we're facing ecological degradation and devastation, this seems to me like a beautiful call to arms of taking up your shepherd's crook or something and go forth and biocomplexify. So.
I broadly agree with all of that, and I love your enthusiasm for it. Areas where I would want to see it fleshed out a little bit more. I think what you're describing is a lot of low-tech, casual cultural activity, which would have to be expanded and clarified in the sense of many people who don't want to do those things. Right, putting them into the story as well. If you are building rockets, if you're making AI, if all you love is hardcore punk music, there has to be a way of expanding this notion to include all the other cultural motives and types of people. Biocomplexity, it's an interesting word. I don't know if I love the flavor of it as much as I like to say biodiversity, but it is, I think, a strong start to try to bring a vertical dimension into the notion of biodiversity. I'm curious how you think about that relating to a more normative dimension, right? So you could think of something like a vertical scale of various kinds of things, but there's healthy or unhealthy, there's adapted or unadapted versions at each scale. So you could say that what the system wants is more biodiversity plus vertical complexity, but you could also say, well, we only want that sometimes when it's really working out, and sometimes it's working out better at a lower level than at a more complex level. So how are you thinking the sort of healthy normative dimension of that in addition to adding a complexity axis?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It raises the question of, could this have a pathological form? Could we biocomplexify so much of the biosphere that causes cascading ruinous effects in some ways? It is a very complex system, of course. So is there some kind of holistic equilibrium between less complex and more complex dynamics across the whole system that leads to, optimal flourishing? I don't know. I'm sure there are certainly elements of that. For example, like if we were just saying, "Hey, we're going to fill in the oceans and with land, and then we're going to make it all grow vegetables," right? We would eventually destroy the whole thing. So there need to be these gradations and gradients and differences. It's certainly, though, we're not anywhere near to be doing that. So in terms of what we should be more concerned about, I think that we could go pretty hard on this and transform things for the better, and just be kind of making a dent in the kinds of things that would be beneficial. So I'm less concerned about the pathological forms that could take, and more just see it as an opportunity. That's just one kind of way at that.
The way I would think about it is there's a possibility of eliciting a more specific hybrid variable. Like, it's hard to say scientifically what simple thing is tracked through different regimes of the cosmos, but Shane was like, no, it's energy, rate, throughput relative to structure. That number keeps going up. Right, so we might be able to find some kind of variable that is the increase or stabilization of biodiversity plus complexity optimization plus optimizing for normal mutual attunement between systems. And we might be able to use our new pattern finding machines to find a pattern in there that we might not otherwise see ourselves, in such a way that it would be extremely flexible and adaptive to output into almost any domain of human activity. One of the questions, and I think you and I come to this problem a lot, which is how much of this is worldview, how much of this is narrative, how much of this is practice, right? I'm always a little bit skeptical of worldviews and narratives. Because not that they're not important to the picture, they play a role, but getting the balance is just right, because not everybody needs to hear a story. Not everybody can understand a story. It's not just an activity for people who are capable of having a cool new big picture that's also attuned to regenerative permacultural principles. It needs to be something that, somebody who's not that, someone with a mental illness who just got out of prison, and you're going to put them to work in an organic farm or something like that, something that they can basically pick up through activities and supplementally slowly start to grow a worldview, but not something where they're where the assumption is they have to change their sensibility first. They have to change it in tandem with practice.
Yeah, well, there's actually where I see a lot of promise, though, because I think we have stories and narratives on offer in our society, and some are more dominant than others, and some of them, they can all be engaged at varying levels of complexity, but if the ones dominantly on offer are something like human beings are a cancer on the planet and we're destroying everything and everything's very awful, it's all because of us, how terrible we are. I actually think that, one, that's a fairly common sentiment that you see, at least I see it in friend groups and social circles a lot. And that can be engaged at different levels of complexity. But you could then get that sort of at a more simple level, and all you're really getting is, wow, human beings are awful, nature good, humans bad, better off if we weren't around. That's a very simple narrative. What if we had the narrative of humans potentially very good, can be good for nature, nature good, humans special intelligence and depth of consciousness and care, want to see more of good nature things. That is something you can just, I think, pretty intuitively and simply digest. But right now, in the current intellectual climate, it's hard for that to be justified at sort of the top-down layer. And so what people are getting downstream of social critique and the academy and a lot of, the more skeptical postmodern orientation is the opposite of that. So I'm not against there being multiple translations of this basic story that that can go all the way up in terms of its complexity, but I would actually see folks being able to work much more productively with a story that says you can be of value and significance in the world, and look how you could do something really great and wonderful. That would actually seem to be much more productive across all kind of levels.
I think it's about getting the fine tuning right between the practice and the story aspects of what this is. And I agree with you that one of the huge functions of story is to provide a counter narrative to what's dominant. Right, even if that were to change over time, right? If it's successfully countermanded that thing, we might not need it as much. But I do still think we need to be very concerned about what the non-narrative elements of this are, right? A lot of what you're pointing to is the top-down, all in on the either modern or the postmodern narrative. But that's not operating in a vacuum. That's operating because somebody's making a fuck ton of money running that system, or there's various other incentive structures that bind that in place. It's not merely a matter of holding that story. The other thing I'm interested in about, and I'm going to skew this more in the typical shamanic direction, which is I'm curious about your sense of the change in human identity, right? What we think of as ourself in all of this. Because one of the things that it looks like modernity does is um, measure the things that are easiest to measure, right? Same with our psychology. We tend to check the easiest things that are up at the front and we go, well, that's the definition of the human being. Whereas a lot of the intelligence functions that are bred into us by billions of years of evolution occur in more subconscious and subtle aspects of ourselves. And in the degree to which we track those or experience them or use them as an attempt to gain actual knowledge about objective reality, we transform our sense of what we are as beings. And we include much more of this background stuff that's not always as easy to see. How important do you think that is in galvanizing a new paradigm? Because there's a deep twinning between the complexity of the sense of the self and the complexity of the sense of the worldview.
Yeah, my sense is that worldviews and stories always go along in tandem with the development of also certain practices and ways that they get applied in the world. And so I think that sensibility and that sensitivity is something very important that should move in tandem with this. I think it's always problematic if it's, oh, we just have the good story now, so that's all we really need. But I think it's kind of what, yeah, I think this came up at some point here around the theory without practice is impotent, but practice without theory is blind, something like that. So I want to see both of those things, but I think that you're also going to see it's going to be less likely that people will develop certain attuned sensitivities to nature absent a story that can contextualize and make sense of that. But if we just have a story that gives that part of it and people aren't doing that second part, it's going to be very impoverished. So I think they go together. I mean, partly why we have such a good rapport is I think you're a lot more praxis oriented, and I'm very interested in this story and the worldview component. And yeah, there's a twinning there. So, but I also think that these could be brought into the education system, and we talked a little bit about that as well over the weekend in terms of working with story fairy tales, but also at an early age encouraging children to relate to trees and ecosystems and animals in a particular kind of way that brings that kind of sensitivity out and makes that something that is part of their experience going forward. Because absent that, you might have a sort of deficit that you can't then draw on in your later development. And because development is it kind of works through sedimentation, you're building off of the earlier building blocks. There's a big problem why, like in very, and you mentioned this as well, like in environments that are very sort of impoverished in terms of the amount of nature and the amount of diversity of textures and colors and all of that, a kind of, just concrete block kind of environment, there's a deprivation of the sensory component, and that actually has long-term educational depressive consequences. So to that same point, if we're not able to build up from earlier intuitions, even deepening and complexifying intuitions of an animate world that we can relate to, then yeah, we're not going to have that there. So that's a really important component. And to bring back in to make the case for the story, there are ways in which the stories push out certain kinds of training or education as being deemed inappropriate or wrong. If you're in a very traditional context and you see the child talking to a tree, you say, stop that, cut it out. You're going to summon the devil or you're going to talk to the sprites. And I mean, there's a way in which there's a fear of certain kinds of pagan relationships and that sort of thing that come from maybe certain kinds of traditional, say, Christian worldview structures that places an inhibition on the kinds of experiences that people will have and then be able to build off of. So that's part of where the story directly kind of creates the context in which kinds of practices can flourish.
Granted, the story has to be one that enables rather than constrains the types of experience of reality we have in order to build our sensibility. Maybe two more things come up for me and we'll open it up. The first one is how important you think it is for the fairy tale of ontology to consist of a fundamental component that is lifelike or ecology-like as opposed to inert, right? Are we thinking of sort of abstract prehending viewers or motes or something, or we do this thing that sort of Nietzsche and Spinoza do, which is think about an appetition, a dynamic process, something that's more has more affinity for ecological models, right? Can we tell a story without changing the basic component of reality? Because in some sense, that's at the root of all storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, that's really hard because, and this is always the challenge, if a story in many ways is about a complexifying cosmos and complexity, how do you tell that very simply? And so there need to be different forms in which we communicate, I think, what's going on here in developmentally appropriate ways. So that's just a part of, I think, what you're getting at. But yeah, I think that there's also different ways to language that. I don't think we need, a new story in a particular kind of top-down way, but there can be different insights that we can leverage from the cutting-edge complexity sciences and regenerative practices that can find their way into early educational contexts in a way that makes sense for people. And then I think ideally you'd want to be able to create a dynamic where that itself naturally leads on to the next thing and on to the next thing, so that maybe the broader vision doesn't come into view until you're in college or after that. But there's still some version of it there that can be communicable and relatable. So that's one element that you're getting at, but it's probably not all of what
Yeah,
you're
I
getting
think
at.
there's probably a whole other discussion on that part. The last thing I wanted to touch on was it'd be great if I had a little bit more clarity about what you see the story consisting of, especially in a big history context, because I'm hearing a story of deviation, attempted correction of deviation, correction of the correction, and then people are going to do some organic gardening,
It's
which is not bad. But you can tell much bigger stories, right? I'm fond of the fairy tale of all complex ecological like systems are always engaged in an attempt to do like self-regulation and self-stabilization, self-transcendence, self-overcoming, self-modification. The entire biosphere is also engaged in an activity like this, and it needs to anchor and flower more, so that we're helping it both in our exterior technological mode and in our interior artistic and intersubjective and spiritual mode. We're helping it to do both of those tasks better. So that means in the expansion, the flowering mode, and this is something, I don't know if anybody read John Allen's stuff about the biospheres and the synagears back in the 70s and 80s. There's been a lot of thinking around this. If the biosphere is organism-like, then what does it do to reproduce and expand? Right? Is it going to sporate into the rest of the cosmos? Is the function of building new sub-biospheres part of a general human process to assist, to be the extension of the biosphere in its replication mode? So I find that an intriguing thing that also then folds in a bunch of the people that don't want to do organic gardening but are thinking about reusable rockets. So what's
Yeah.
the big story?
The big story, as I see it, is that nature is a profoundly unified, coherent totality, but one that has been evolving through a set of principles to increasingly complex levels that also bring deeper degrees of intelligence, consciousness, and care. And that we are a part of that process and in some ways at the horizon of that process. And that we can contribute to it or we can fail collectively to the degree that we don't successfully see that story and internalize its patterns and help make human society as sustainable and thriving as other ecological systems. So the story for me is one profoundly spiritual because it puts us at home in the cosmos, which I think is the religioning function. It's saying this, you're a part of this. There's a person-friendly element to the universe, which is so much of what modernity kind of took away. It's like, ooh, we're just people in this otherwise dark, vast, cosmic void that is entirely coldly indifferent to us. But actually, that the human is a flowering and a natural product of this story. I think that is a beautiful tale. I think it's spiritually satisfying, and it allows us to relate this really marvelous story, myth like about metamorphosis over billions of years to our own experience of our day-to-day lives, and to be part of a process collectively that's somehow cooperative in those principles. So I think that brings back what you're getting at is, yeah, it's not everyone doing regenerative gardening, but maybe it's some of that. And maybe there's also something to be said about the rocket building and the trying to terraform other planets and set up biospheres in other places. Maybe just being really into punk rock and loving that is an expression of deep vitality that is, a version of an example of the driving vital impulse that's behind all of this. And so it doesn't all need to conform into a particular, this is what some people need to do and this is what other people should all be doing. It's a plurality of different modes of expression of these deep principles. And if you're in that kind of alethic resonance with those deep principles, you're going to be part of a natural, and in this case social ecosystem, amplifying that to some degree. But it also makes you aware of where you're out of alignment and makes you understand why certain things break down complexity and break down through a kind of entropic process, social cohesion, emotional coherence. And as we wane in care and regard and consciousness, we're getting further away from the trajectory that the cosmos has been unfolding along for billions of years. So I think it gives us a sense of orientation in a profound way as well. And I mean, there's so much more I could say about all that because this is my passion, and the narrativization of this in a way that that homes us is really crucial. But that's just one quick version of it, I guess.
All right, I'm sold.
Yes.
Let's see what everybody else thinks. We've got a mic here that can move around if anybody wants to talk on a recording.
Yeah, I'm remembering Tyson Yunkaporta talking about humans as a custodial species, and he said that this is not something where we mastermind the complexity. We increase the complexity and the relatedness of the organisms and elements of the ecosystem through light touch interventions. And also that what helps a lot of these indigenous cultures is to think of the elements of nature, the trees, the things that, I guess if we, think about it scientifically, these things aren't really conscious, like rocks, but that it helps to think of them as having a perspective, as having a relation, as almost like having their own consciousness and their own story. You don't have to believe in ghosts. There's a spirit. The rock has a spirit, and then thinking of things that way helps you understand their relation. The spirit of the rock, the spirit of the tree, the spirit of the cliffside, and the stream coming through, and you can tell a story of how these interact with each other, and then that can guide the human integration with nature and the increase of complexity and increase of relationships to find that optimal balance.
I have a couple of thoughts, but you want to?
No, I'm just impressed how overtly shamanic Brad it keeps becoming.
I'd say, I guess, two things to that. One is, I wanted to hit on this actually in my opening thoughts, was that this question of custodianship or stewardship, which is a particular model that I think is available in terms of understanding our relationship to the biosphere. I think that's certainly much better than a domination model or, go forth and multiply and take what you need because this has been given to you and it's kind of raw materials for your betterment, certainly. But I also think that there's a sense implicit there that we're just taking care of something that already exists, which we certainly are. But I'm trying to get it a little bit more than that, which is that we're not just trying to preserve and maintain, we're trying to amplify and increase and grow those phenomena. So that's a different, maybe more, maybe that's would be considered maybe more audacious or yeah.
So it sounds like you're contrasting what you're saying with a model of conservation. The Yunkaporta model, or the way he would present it seems a little bit more geared toward conservation, where you're geared toward like an imagined possible future that has never existed that actually can be an even more thriving biosphere or ecological niches than has ever existed.
Yeah, something like, if you are the steward of a plot of land, it could just be a field of grass. And if your perceived role in relationship is to just maintain that as it is, there's certainly value there. And that's certainly a much better orientation than, how can I sell this and profit from it and develop it into, a high rise, whatever, and be part of this more corrosive sort of industrial thing. So relative to that, great. And also, I don't want to be absolutistic about this. There are places in which high-rise buildings work in the context so it's not like we should only prioritize biocomplexity over all other things. There are ways in which human noospheric and technological complexity has a role in a part of this niche. But the basic difference is just, rather than say, let's maintain what is here, there's the question of, is there any way that we could actually intervene and alter what is here to amplify more of the fecundity, right? So maybe there's only 10 species of bug in that field, but what if, there's a slight divot made here that the rain is able to pool into that now changes that slightly, and now you've got 20 species of bug that have found a new niche there, and that brings other kinds of animals in, and you've changed the ecosystem, but you haven't made it less complex, you've made it more complex. And so it's kind of the difference between being a kind of, almost like a maintenance landscaper versus like a cultivating gardener. And I see that there's at least a very important role to emphasize that component of enhancing and bringing forth the fecundity and participating in it. Two last quick thoughts is just that I think is a way in which we can understand that we're not just sort of stepping back from what's already there and prioritizing what nature has sort of offered us. We're also saying, how can we work with nature to bring forth even deeper things in a kind of partnership? So there's and then I had another point around the spirit versus a kind of sacred issue, but if you wanted to.
Sure. I love the conversation in the garden yesterday that sort of came around to having humility and audacity together and sort of organizing those in the concept of reverence. I grew up in a gardening family, so a cultivationist metaphor is very essential to how I think about everything, which does involve an amplifying as much as it does a securing. But having kids in my life changes the way I hold those balances. It's a little different than having a garden. You want them to be basically secure and healthy and well-fed and all that stuff, but you also want them to become something different than they are. You want to assist them to learn language, to become stronger, to become smarter, to have broader ranges of experience that are not occurring necessarily in the household. So a trajectory that goes outside of the sort of established garden of self-regulating patterns is also important. Yeah, that's probably enough.
Well, real quick, I just wanted. I think we can also tell this story and bring forth these sensitivities without necessarily employing a particular kind of animism. That can be one way that works. But one thing that's really interesting for me is how there is a sacred element, certainly, to a rock, if there's not necessarily a spirit in the rock. And I think one can appreciate that. And obviously this depends on what we mean by spirit and how we want to interpret that. But these can be different ways of drawing forth that sacred intensity of something. I can hold a rock in my hand and not necessarily relate to it as a kind of other in some kind of mode like that, but I can just hold it in its beauty and its suchness and its intensity and just say, this this is of profound value and significance. So there's something we can cultivate around that. And when I have that experience with you, it is very much as some other that I presume is sharing a similar kind of conscious state, and we're able to connect deeper because of the relative level of complexity that we're trying to bring out of the world. So I'm open to these different modes and options, but that one is the one that tends to work a little bit better for me in terms of bringing that out.
All right, we're going to get to Shane in a second, I promise. There's one other element to this notion of whether it's more conservationist or more increase oriented. And I think we have to have the increase in because there's a kind of, there's a set of multiple possibilities of how we do the new narrative making going on. And there are other people in these extended networks, right? I'm going to pick on the cosmorotic humanists because I contrast them against more of an eco-cosmic humanism. And these people are telling a story of increase. Something is moving forward. We're going to have more value in the cosmos tomorrow than we had yesterday. There are versions of this story. Smart people are behind them. They're very compelling because they excite certain aspects of our being. And we don't want a very healthy, ecologically oriented story to lose out to people who just think we can get way more turned on in the future than we were in the past. So I think there's a little bit of culture war dynamics within the scene at play. Shane.
Yeah, so I think
Let me
that.
stop you there. I just no.
All right, that's all I had to say. No, I love the aspiration of this, and I think like it's so obvious that this is like the human potential, and we are so far from actually being able to practically implement anything like this. And on any large scale, like one person could do it, maybe a small group here and there, but to be able to actually implement something like this to where it affects the biosphere in any meaningful way is so far from reality. And I wonder if we're almost like worldview bypassing because our systems are still so modern and exploitative and extractive that we don't even have a postmodern structure really at all. And I wonder if there's like an intermediary step where we just stop causing the harm and then kind of let stuff regenerate. And then from there, then we go and we do more kind of intentional biocomplexity. Like how can we really like make life so much more beautiful?
I mean, if you could get everybody to stop, that would be a great strategy. But, well, some people stop causing the harm, other people will continue charging ahead. So there has to also be a very powerful competitive element to it. I think there are ways in which we could be very close to large-scale implementations. There are things that hold us back ideologically, but there are tweaks to the way we do the economy. There are new, interesting pattern-making machines that might be able to elicit and distribute the variables out of which we build things. We have a lot of new informational and technological capacities, and there may be very small tweaks that create enormous changes that we're not very far away from. Now, we could say we're far away in terms of persuading people to actually engage in that. But I think there's an optimism in seeing that those potentials for high leverage are actually not too far away. But yes, there'll be lots of situations in which we should just totally chill out and try to let the damage handle itself before we build too much new structure.
Yeah, I think all of the above are necessary. What I mean, though, by that is wherever possible, then people can pull back from extractive and just purely exploitative processes. Yes, we need that. We need regulations to help ensure that that's the case and put a limit and be a regulatory function on the social organism to stop certain kinds of extractive practices. So that is a big component, a sort of negative component of taking away. At the same time, one of the most difficult things about systems change is that we are all embedded in the system, and the system can't just stop. And actually, if the system all just stopped, there's at least an ethical question of would that be catastrophically worse than if we're able to transform the system towards something regenerative and sustainable. And so is it a kind of like radical intervention, in which case you might see billions of people starve to death? Or is it a transformative process in which you have to rework the entire system from within to, in a sense, update fix the ship while it's on the ocean, right? And so that's more what I gravitate towards, is that we need to find all the ways that we can make systemic interventions to put something into place to replace an old system that is extractive with something that's not. And there are different scales to that. So that's a really difficult thing, I think, that we face collectively and individually, because it's like we're all also here using electricity and wearing things that were made however by whoever, and these kinds of questions. So we're deeply implicated in the existing system, and we're trying to change it from within. And even if we were to just stop it all, even the changes to transform society would, in a sense, lose their basis of operation, and everything would kind of face radical consequences. So I guess I'm more of an evolutionist than a revolutionist in that sense, but we need an evolutionary revolution.
Yeah, totally. And one last thing I want to hand to someone else. So like, it seems like where you're coming from is like, okay, we'll make systems that are not just not bad for the environment, but we'll make systems that are actually really good for the environment and can be a win-win. And I wonder, like, something like a circular economy, right? That isn't really in that circle as much as it's just not causing more harm, because you're just kind of looping the same extractive back into itself. And so it's not like adding to the biocomplexity, but it's not taking away from it. And I wonder if like you see that as an aspect of what you'd like to do, or is that kind of one step behind?
No, I think that's great. I mean, yeah, we want closed loops, that's ideal. There are continual, what would you say, growth processes that still are playing out even with the best closed loops. So there's some still degree of change and development even with the best of those happening. But I would say, yeah, that there's something more like people, in a sense, need to get up and go to work and do a thing, right? So if most of that is currently extractive and destructive, we can't just sort of take that away and then what, right? It's sort of like, how can we find new kinds of regenerative industry, I guess you could say? How could we take the principles that are happening here at a small scale and scale them up? And how can there be private public sector partnerships that are able to there's so much that we're not doing because we're still very much beholden to a certain kind of system and an ideology that supports it. And I am also I would emphasize something Nick said earlier today, which is that these systems are downstream of worldviews. And so I think you're pointing out something really important with this idea of worldview bypassing. Like, we don't want to just say, oh, well, we'll change the whole worldview and then we'll fix everything. And let's just spend the rest of our time talking about worldviews and not changing the system. But there needs to be both, obviously. And I would say that really crucial work needs to happen at the worldview level if you're going to see sustainable shifts into a new kind of system, because you need to have legitimization processes that make people say, yes, this is the right way to do it, and it's good that we move in this direction. And if we don't have that, you could try to force these things on the world, but there's going to be radical reflex authoritarianism and reactionary politics and a lot of the things that we're in some ways seeing now, but even more amplified. So this needs to be a bottom-up, top-down, side-to-side, all across the board kind of approach.
I think if you need to, in terms of worldview bypassing, you have to make sure we're not skipping over just a lot of low-hanging fruit from the pluralist ecological mindset. Right? There's very little robust implementation of green level systems in a healthy way in the world. So that's a huge part of this, right? I think we want to be kind of meta-progressive, and so we want to be at least minimally a healthy green system that handles this. And the integration of many closed loop cyclic feedback systems that have a kind of self-regulating calendar, that creates emergent effects that unfold as evolutionary-like phenomenon, right? So everything sort of runs on these loops, but these loops are not perfectly self-contained. They have a little bit of excess they can produce, and the integration of many things that produce a little bit of excess produces a new thing that can do strange, novel things. So there's a way in which those really work closely together in a good system.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the worldview aspect of this a little bit more, and yeah, I'm just curious if you guys could reflect on that a bit. Some of what I'm thinking about there has to do with to what extent I mean, let me back up and say I'm very inspired by this kind of vision that you're painting here. I think it's a beautiful narrative. I think it has a lot of potential to it, and it's very resonant with my own, perspective on things. I'm curious. I mean, if we sort of gloss over the developmental worldview aspect of it, it's kind of an easier pitch in a sense, right? But I'm curious, if we draw that aspect of it out, to what extent do we actually need people to embody something like an integrative meta-systematic worldview to be able to scan across the horizon of multiple systems and look at, okay, what would be an intervention that would actually facilitate more fecundity, more biocomplexity, more sustainability, etc. And to what extent, it be problematic if we're pitching that and then people are taking that up and they don't actually have that epistemic capacity. And so that's sort of point A. And then B is like also, Hansi's notion of kind of depth, kind of a spiritual depth and the capacity to not only be aware of like what are the ecological principles that are informing this kind of practice in a kind of theoretic sense, but also to do that, what we talked about earlier, alethic listening, like to tap into one's kind of multi-tiered intuition system to be able to listen and tailor an intervention to the uniqueness and idiosyncrasy of a particular location in a space-time trajectory. And so, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's huge. Thanks. I mean, I would say some of that, the second part of that definitely gets back to the practice and versus just the story part, but I'll come to that, I guess. I would say, yes, totally. We need to situate this in a developmental context individually and collectively. And you're going to get insufficient understanding and engagement with this narrative, with this worldview, with this code, if there's lacking requisite complexity to appreciate how those parts actually work together. So there is a kind of optimal fit between sort of certain cognitive structures and certain narrative structures. Totally. And I think my view would be that we really want to amplify the number of folks who are able to work with those narratives and those codes at those levels. But I think it would be probably unrealistic to expect that, I don't know, this is just going to become the new story, and then there's some kind of mass whole scale kind of developmental transformation of society in a kind of age of Aquarius. I mean, we have to be very practical about like, what does that actually look like? And then you have to get into the education system and see how we're actually working there. So what I'm getting at is that my hope would be maybe at best in the next short-term period, we will see more of that metasystematic cognition that's able to engage with this code and this worldview and do some really powerful and effective things at that level with it. But I'm also of the mind that we need to communicate these ideas to a broader, demographic reach for people to work with and play with. For me, it was a transformation when I found these ideas. And had I even been aware of this stuff at any point earlier, it would have been a profoundly different existential situation that I found myself in, and much less suffering and much less, grappling with the situation. And so I think there are ways in which these ideas, these concepts, these conceptual tools can be really helpful, even if it's not like, and I totally see the metasystematic relationship of all this. So we need them to be able to work up and down the stack, would be my thought. And the whole time being able to improve our education system so that, the kind of ratios are always kind of improving for how much of this people can really connect with and tap into. Again, just on the second point, I would say that it takes being aware of a thing to have an evaluation of it in a kind of relationship. Like a child is not going to be anxious about the economy because it's just not in their kind of cognitive structural capacity. So that means that things related to the economy are going to be outside the realm of concern and care and emotion and relationship. So that means, though, that it's similarly, if people aren't aware of there's some form of a big cosmic, big history story of human history and how we fit into that story and this kind of a thing, then they can't relate to it and they can't develop certain sensibilities in relation, certain kinds of spiritual skill sets and that sort of thing, and do the kind of listening, because they don't have the at least basic architecture to work with. I didn't for a long, long time, most of my life, right? So I think just at the very least, it's helpful to get these ideas out there in a way that lots of different people can at least engage with them and start to work with them.
On the first point, I would address it mostly through the stratification of social roles. So if we think about it by analogy to religion, a chaplain has a different task than a theologian, but they're both on the same team. One of them has to be able to say a very sophisticated, elaborate version to other intelligent people about how we need to contextualize this. So I think the vertical and developmental aspects are essential, but they're not essential at the everyday level of talking to someone, right? We have to be able to spread a story that's stabilizing and edifying, and where people are interested in or capable of it grow into this other capacity that probably has more exchange with the technocratic elements of restructuring society and things than these people do. But there's a lot of different functions traditionally associated with the cultural movement. And another one, in addition to, say, chaplains and theologians and clergy, is the saint. Right, so the saint represents the second part of the question, which is where does depth, where does beingness, where do these sort of developmental spiritual aspects of this come in? I tend to think generally about things achieving integrated coherence, right? That a certain balance of becomings becomes a quality like a being. And the argument of the saints, to me, has seemingly been that if there's a higher level of internal coherence between parts of the individuals in particular, the indirect and long-term outcome of their actions will tend to go in the right direction. And if there isn't, it will tend to go in the wrong direction, even if they are saying and believing exactly the right thing. Now, that's something I relate to very much. It's also something we should hold in a skeptical position, but that's how I would address that. Who else? Should we invite one of the ladies to speak? No? Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question. Well, real quick, I'll double down on this thought, because I think one thing that really tripped up some of the new age eschatological hopes, for this transformational better world, was a sense that there was going to be a profound change at all kind of levels of society that would move into higher consciousness or something. And so, I mean, even Wilbur helps kind of attenuate that and be like, you really just need like 5% or whatever. I think there's a lot to that. I think though, I think we need to be realistic about how systems change and some of the particularly important leverage points. So again, I always just keep coming back to fixing the educational system. There are, speaking of low-hanging fruit, there are things that we could do that could just set us up for so much more developmental possibility than is currently the case, which is actually largely being, regressed under our current regime in terms of how education is done. So in developmental contexts, a lot of folks want to go to, there are these altitudes of consciousness. We just got to bring everyone up. And then if everyone is teal or this or that, we'll change the world. But I think that is not going to be realistic. And also then there's even just questions of, even if it were realistic, is that actually the way it would work or should work or, so I think there's just a different approach to this, of appreciating that there's always going to be, and I would say probably should be, a lot of beautiful diversity in terms of how people think and their cognitive structures and and the codes that they use. But we do want greater coherence, and so we do want a code at a particular complexity level that can do the work that we need to do. We just don't need to think about that as leveling up the entire system to higher consciousness per se. I think there are other ways of thinking about that.
Yeah, I agree. I was feeling like this is a really powerful overarching meta narrative that I think can be widely disseminated and has resonance for people across the developmental stack. But sort of, behind the scenes, there's maybe an understanding that there might be an appropriate scale of practice that would be applicable to each of these folks at these different levels. And so, I mean, that's one way that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, the broader, I mean, not just reform of the immediate educational institutions, but a broader ongoing educational culture as the definition of culture to some degree, which means an idea that there's somewhere to go, that there's a value in increasing your ranges of experience and nuance and the number and types of patterns you can take into account in a way that's not too forced, but is generally encouraged, like a broadly shared cultivationist ethos.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you start to wonder about like what kind of effects this could have on a kind of civic spirit or civic narrative. You know, like what actually unites people around a common cause to do big political projects together, right? If we had a culture in which people were like, wow, it's so incredible to be able to, you know, gain the capacities to help nature thrive, flourish, and grow. And if there was some kind of a kind of like, what did was it Jimmy Carter who said something, we need the equivalent of war or something, in terms of, he was talking about doing certain kinds of social you know, engagement and development processes, but there, what he meant was the kind of ethos that gathers people together to be like, we're all going to do this thing and we're going to go be united and in a sense fight against a thing. Well, if you're fighting, let's say, entropy, or you're fighting fragmentation, dissolution, you're fighting you know, things that limit the potentials of nature to flourish and thrive more fully. There's an just interesting, probably still also unrealistic notion that we could collectively gather around some sort of uniting purpose like that. And honestly, if there's going to be a galvanizing force that's going to start to force that issue, it's going to be consequences of the Metacrisis, where, you know, you're going to actually start seeing what we're seeing, and it's going to increase, and you're going to get rising, you know, tides. You're going to get, you know, desertification, plastification. All the ecological things summon us to collective action. And if we saw that in the lens of, hey, how do we, in a sense, re-gear society, not to go off and bomb some group of people, but to go build up a flourishing, you know, global planetary culture that is in tune with nature and can be sustainable. That's like the call to action that I think would be profound.
And it also seems to me like what you're saying is that it might be that as the metacrisis unfolds and we start, you know, experiencing, in a sense, the negative side of the metacrisis, more extreme weather events and more societal breakdown, that perhaps that these folks that are putting this kind of thing into practice, and they're actually, we know how to create kind of superabundance in nature, that might start to become very appealing across the developmental stack. Oh wow, you know how to survive and thrive in these increasingly unstable times. And
yeah, necessity kind of, is the mother of invention. Eh?
Yeah, going off that was really interesting. I think I come back to identity as being a really important process and understanding in order to allow that to happen. The meta crisis, as it continues and like all kinds of environmental destruction happens, if your lack of awareness of what your identity is and you take it to be serious, that's going to lead you to likely bomb somebody out of response just because you don't really understand why this is going on. And I think going back to what you were saying regarding the saints process, or like the clergy process, in the sense of we need to find ways for people to experientially increase their awareness of not only their group identities that cause a lot of the kind of cascading issues of metacrisis, but also who they actually are. And when we're able to do that, not only necessarily on a social identity basis, but as human beings, we can engage in that like heard this a lot this weekend, transrational process, where we're going to be able to actually translate our understanding of who we are into how we respond to nature. And so when Rich had that talk about being in nature, feeling as a kid with the hands in the mud, going through life in this really open, aware way, that's how we come into the world. And as we learn who I am, like my race, my religion, all these things, they kind of constrict that perception and view. And so when we talk about the not to worldview bypass, in order for us to be able to actually create change to not only save the environment, but also increase the complexity, I think we're going to really have to find ways not just to communicate, but give people modalities and ways where they can introspect and see. And so when they go out and see a tree, right, like Rich took us on that walk yesterday, it's a whole nother experience. Whereas if I'm worried about the economy, like I'm stressed at home, I feel like I'm going to blame some other ethnic group for my issues, that tree is maybe at best like something I'm going to use to chop down to like burn my home or worse, right? It's like a nuisance. And it'd be really interesting to hear you guys talk about if you are aware of any modalities or practices or ways of knowing or being or inquiry people can also engage in that's not necessarily dependent on the development levels. And that's why I really like psychotherapy a lot. It has its problems, has its issues, but the idea is it's trying to find ways for people at various levels of development to just increase their awareness more, because instead of then trying to engage in something that would be more harmful, it becomes less harmful, and that less harm actually helps that ecosystem and biosphere, as you say. So I'd be really curious to see any thoughts on like those processes or how we can continue to refine our understanding of ourselves as our groups, but also as human beings and also as these beings in relation to this ecosystem.
I mean, in specific, that's great. I mean, yes, that is so necessary. I think we were talking about like the Keegan stuff and its relationship to politics, and that's really huge. But it sounds like you're also really narrowing in on like, okay, yes, but at every level, what can folks do? And then I feel like, you know, one thing that can be really significant there and has been for many is a kind of meditation practice, which is basically a different angle into the question of who are you, what is the self, and you know all that. It's sort of like a parallel kind of way to explore the same question, but you can be anywhere in your developmental journey and do those kinds of practices of self-inquiry and start to expand. You know, you're like, oh, well, I thought I was this, and actually, but then who am I if I'm watching that and all that stuff? So that immediately just comes to mind as like a track or a trajectory that you could bring into every context. And in the Listening Society, for example, we talk about small changes that are possible. You know, Hansi cites some examples of introducing meditation into schools and how that can have cascading effects on, you know, quality of life and emotional regulation and all these things. So that's my first thought, I guess, on that.
Yeah, I don't know what time it is because we were going to do a session on reframing psychotechnologies relative to the biosphere, but we might not get there. We also did a thing a couple of days ago on what the basic components of metamodern spirituality would be. So that's a big conversation we could have. Yes, all the standard things, you know, being healthy, probably getting clean water is as important as doing psychotherapy, meditation of various kinds. But one of the things that stood out to me from your question was the feedback loop between identity and perception, right? Rich's story is I mean, I love that he begins with this personal narrative because it is a lot about you have to go back and really deep into seeing and experiencing all of these things in the natural world to stabilize a sense of identity that is kind of consonant with all of these things. So there's a kind of a repetition and a nuance and an attitudinal appreciation of the complex and the strange. And then we could think about building that out because there are practices that enable different ranges of perception and then also ones that enable different degrees of assimilation. So obviously, you know, on purpose trying to look at little details of the environment, that's already pretty good. Doing it in various chemical states would be useful. Doing it with different kinds of people. There's all that kind of stuff. Tracking it, you know, like Rich says, if you're looking for things that are expressive of a pattern that exists over a long range of time, you might make different observations, and those accumulate into a different sense of identity. Well, one of the ones that fascinates me the most in kind of this meta-shamanic discourse is the possibility of what our ancestors might have called omen reading or something like that, right? It's a way of appreciating a peculiarity within a natural structure and then trying to find a meaning that you can decode using another one of your systems. So for me, the example is always, you know, I see a raven do a really weird thing, and there's a feeling that goes with that. And then I start to do a process. I don't know if anyone knows Genlin's focusing technique, but it's similar. I'm free-form looking for words that go with that particular subtle feeling. And when I find one, it's not necessarily true, but it temporarily locks in and it joins that peculiarity with another aspect of my system. It's increasing my overall integration, but it puts me into a different mode. It feels like I'm receiving an imaginal download from that thing. And I believe a bunch of our ancestors regularly did this as part of their attempt to derive information from the ecosystem, but also it does help really cement and stabilize your sense of self.
Yeah. And that's really cool. And I think meditation's done the rounds. It's great. Like now you have all kinds of apps, right, that charge all kinds of money. So you know it's really made its like way in society. But I think the really cool thing about metamodernism or these kind of new ways of looking and seeing is that we can kind of take it out of this kind of sit still, focus kind of thing, but recognize the relation between attention and perception it has to go through all 5 senses, including thinking. And different people have different ways or strong strengths in doing so. And so if we're able to kind of I say this all the time, people are like, oh, you're assimilating or appropriating, but take these things not necessarily out of the traditions, but speak to the essence or truth of these traditions and these practices. And then we can bring them out into these places where people can actually interact with them, but it's not mediated by some type of ideology or thought or theory, but it's like, do you hear that? Do you feel that? Do you smell that? And that's undeniable, right? But the issue sometimes is that it goes to a very, I would say sometimes the most subjective sense of experience, right? Something that I can't be sure you feel, but when we both feel it, it's undeniable, it's unquestionable. And I think it would be really, really cool as we continue to kind of want to try and find ways to deal with the situation ecologically, is that when we start to begin to continue these sorts of ways of integrating with our reality, we have, again, that ecosystem thinking or ecosystem being, in the sense that somebody being a little more attuned to the smell of grass after cutting it in a suburb may have micro changes that have other effects to other people. They may be nicer to their partner. They may be more willing to go play outside with their kid. These have cascading effects that I think are incredibly important. And I think was problem with a lot of the other previous paradigms is that we have to have an objective, measurable outcome in order to achieve and say, this is perfect, this is good, this is making it. Whereas if we kind of take a step back again and understand what they call it, the holistic approach or whatever, we're going to be able to actually affect change without knowing it. But there is also a knowing, and this is where my woo comes in, that you can sense when you play with children in the yard. There's a feeling and a deep intimacy where you're like, this mattered to me, this mattered to them, and this mattered to them more than they'll ever be able to understand, because they don't have the capacity to it, but it doesn't matter. And I think this is really, where I come in. I feel like, because my focus is on the political, and per se, not political in the sense of just elections alone, but how do you translate ideas and theory into actual action that leads to actual change? But I have to make that balance between wanting to see the change. That's why I do like the capital P politics and voting, but also the change that I can't see. But then my faith goes, I know is happening, I feel, and I hope continues. And so that's where maybe the meta-shamanic dialogues I don't really know more about may come into it. So this is really, really great. And it gives me a lot of hope for how we can actually translate some of these really important thoughts and have that combination. And so I'm kind of lean more towards your sides and sort of the practice part of it. But this has just been really great.
Yeah, great. I love that. And that's, that is kind of a, whatever we want to call them. We don't have to keep using the word shamanic, but there's usually people in a human village who stand for a parasocial version of authenticity and attunement and resonance.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
essential, that we have instincts built into us to use, but we forget and we accrete this other layer over top. And traditionally there used to be things like various status eroding rituals. Once a year the shaman priest would come and the king has to be demoted to the lowest position, at least for a day, or you have to go through various ordeals and things that disrupt that layer, because that layer does sort of co-opt all the rest of them. Now, I think there's a possibility of finding patterns in an objective sense that correspond to that really well, because one of the things that, particularly digital tools, but the science of the last 100 years does not look like the science of the 19th century. And it consists mostly of the discovery that there's functional, coherent patterns of order that don't look immediately obvious to us. So we're gaining an intuition, right, that there are these indirect forms of organization. And as we do that, we can have more objective trust, and we can make better guesses about how to implement them, even as social protocols that might be able to create effects that are smarter than we can figure out, but nonetheless we can participate in.
Yeah, and that's really beautiful, because my parents grew up in very natural environments in West Africa. But very natural environments in West Africa. And so sometimes people try to make it, whoa, wow, you're so into nature. But there is something about, my dad used to say that when you're walking around in the forest and you hear this ambient sound that we now have to have artists make and put in speakers and spas and whatnot, but it's just natural. It's there. And so it's a 360 experience of how nature is. It changes your view of reality. So I remember I was going through my own existential crisis about religion, so on and so forth. He goes, you're overthinking this. We're the animals and God is the farmer, right? Just the farmer we can't see, right? And the way he would talk about it, it didn't fit within the Christian context, even though that's what like I was raised in. But again, that Christian animistic, you can't really separate it. And so it's when we're able to touch into these environmental experiences very simply, like in the nature walk. I went to a nature walk in Sequoia National Park, and the way they told us to listen to the sound of the trees and like what kind of animals do you hear. I go home and I'm writing, and new ideas are coming around that I didn't even understand or could even connect to why that happened, but I knew was strongly related. And so that sort of process, if we're able to, it's hard to measure, but if we can call it out and name it and say like, this happened to me, we're then going back to that qualitative subjective experience, and that creates almost like in a church, that sense of togetherness and knowing like, wow, we are doing this. We are building something together. We are shifting our experience and our ways of being through this very embodied physical process, but cannot be at all separated from the thinking or the theory. And so this is, I could talk all along about this, but it's a really beautiful way for us to try and continue to open ourselves up and allow for whatever comes to flow through us. And
there may be more people to speak, or maybe we're coming toward the end of this, but you touched on something with the ambience that I wanted to highlight, which is elemental immersion. Right? So it's not always immersive, these things, but it seems to me there's a neuropsychological process with sociological implications that gets activated when we are sort of fully in an element of nature as our experiential context, right? It's one thing to see a tree, it's another thing to be in the woods. It's one thing to go down to the creek, it's another thing to put your head all the way under the water. It's one thing to have a fire, it's another to waft the smoke all over you. So these kinds of immersion experiences, I think, trigger a response to being in a different system, which triggers a different identity function.
exactly.
I would just say real quick too, and then we should probably draw to a close. Sensitivity. We have this sort of dual inverted process going on where simultaneously things are becoming more complex in culture, and in some ways the new capacities come online for kinds of experience and kinds of understanding and knowledge that were never maybe possible before. But we also create these more modern environments that wind up desensitizing us to a lot of the complexity in the world. And so one of the things around, in a sense, not just sort of like development in terms of thought and what ideas can we have and all that, is just how can we develop our sensitivity to the world, to be more receptive, to be more curious about things and be able to attend to that and feel that in us. And I think that's also something that can happen. Everyone can engage in some form of that. But it's like we need to be more intentional about it than ever before because of how our kind of social contexts have narrowed the kind of aesthetic, sensual activity that's possible, or have sort of exploded it so much that we have to kind of tune out the noise, right? And walk through certain environments and be like, I'm just trying to get to work, or I'm just trying to do this. So that's a challenge we need to work with and become more sensitive beings, to be more sensitive to relationship.
Yeah, perfect. That's a wonderful way to end. Would y'all please give me to give a hand to our wonderful speakers and everybody else here?
Give a special hand to our audiovisual guy who's been fantastic.
Shane in the back. Shane right there. Big hand to Shane.
Also a hand to Nick and Eudaimonia and the folks here.
Yeah.
Okay, that was R-ing the Bee Eudaimonia edition. Thank you, everyone.
Out.
We out. We out of here.